Oh, there should be. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this new installment of the FSR Insights series. Welcome from my side, Nicolò, Concetto, and Marzia Sini, who is sharing with me this series at FSR. Today, we, let's say, start a block of 2 sessions, actually, before the summer break on developments in the EU, in the energy and climate EU landscape. And more specifically, today, we are glad to have Bernardo Rangoni with us. And with him, we will speak about experimentalist governance in energy. Thank you, Bernardo, for joining. Bernardo is an associate professor in politics at the University of York. He's also Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Antwerp, but also visiting fellow at the EY. He published a book a few months ago on the topic, and it was very interesting. It was, I think, a kind of a summary of his work over the past few years. And so we thought it was good to invite him. Together with him, we have today Torbjörg Jevnaker, who maybe some of you are also familiar with, because with us, she's co-director of the course on the Green Deal. Torbjörg is at Cicero Institute, and she was also at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Norway. Welcome very much, Torbjörg. And finally, we have Max Mutschmeyer, is a researcher at the Florence School of Regulation. And these two will drill a bit Bernardo, posing some questions to him, before then moving to the Q&A, where you, the audience, can pose questions, share comments with our guest of today, and Marzia will moderate the interaction. You know that there is a chat box for questions. You can already start to write there your questions if they come to your mind while Bernardo is speaking. But if there is nothing else, I would immediately give the screen to Bernardo so he can make his presentation. Thank you very much, Bernardo.
Thanks a lot to you, Nicolò and Marzia, and also to the discussants, Max and Torbjörg, and thanks also to the audience for making up time for this. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you see the presentation.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so what I'm going to present today is indeed some findings, mainly from a book, my first book, which I was fortunate enough to publish with Oxford University Press. And I'm going to start the presentation by explaining why we should care about all this. And I'm going to do that by making a reference to some events that we are all unfortunately familiar with. So we unfortunately came to learn through experience that there were some issues with the COVID-19 vaccines. So here you have a picture of a poor young psychologist who died a few hours after receiving the AstraZeneca vaccine. We also came to learn that there might be some increased risks of stroke for certain patients when the COVID-19 vaccine is given in combination with other vaccines. We also came to learn that there might be an association between myocarditis and COVID-19 vaccines. And finally, even for the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccine, which was much less problematic than the AstraZeneca one, we see that issues emerged from practice there as well. And a demonstration of that is that nowadays we have hundreds of Germans claiming for compensations after having received the jab. So what was the EU regulatory answer? It was to set up a regulatory framework that doesn't end with a regulatory decision, but instead continues and puts quite a lot of emphasis on monitoring afterwards. So in the EU, we have the so-called EU Vigilance, which is a huge database where the EMA, the EU Regulatory Agency for Pharmaceuticals, is responsible for collecting suspected side effect reports. These reports are submitted by other actors, lower level actors, for example, national regulators, for example, companies themselves, for example, associations of patients and doctors. And this huge monitoring exercise called pharmacovigilance regularly leads to revisions of the initial regulatory decisions. Now, of course, the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccine or the COVID-19 vaccines more generally is an extreme example, but it helps to illustrate this pattern. And here we had no less than 23 key developments or revisions in a temporal space which was very limited, only a couple of years. The medicine was progressively extended to additional patient categories, and also additional side effects were added to the product information as we learned about them via practical experience. Now, in energy as well, on which of course this presentation focuses, in energy too, we have non-hierarchical institutional arrangements. Think about regulatory fora. Some of you will be very familiar with the Florence Forum or the Madrid Forum. I'm gonna delve into that later on in the presentation. But you can also think about the European networks of national regulators, or you can even think of ACER, which is an EU regulatory agency that, however, is networked because its board is composed by national regulators. Now, the point for us here is that all these non-hierarchical institutional structures, they create the potential for non-hierarchical governance. What do I mean by that? Let me compare non-hierarchical governance to hierarchical governance. Hierarchical governance is really the conventional regulatory governance approach. So here we would have rules that are developed and imposed from the top. So in the EU context, that would be, for example, from the European Commission. Then this is followed by compliance monitoring. And finally, rules are supposed to be stable. Okay, in this mode of governance, there is not much space for revisions, or at least they are not envisaged. In non-hierarchical governance, which in the book I conceptualize as experimentalist governance, but that's certainly not the only way in which one can do so, we have quite a different approach to regulation. So we have rules or regulatory solutions that are at least in part developed by lower level actors. Lower level actors in the EU context can be, for example, national regulatory authorities and or companies. Afterwards, we have a monitoring that doesn't focus so much on ensuring compliance. It is more focused on understanding which solutions are working best on the ground. Okay, so there is more focus on performance evaluation rather than compliance monitoring. And third and finally, rules are supposed to be revised by design. There is an expectation that rules will be revised in the light of these performance reviews. So you can think of non-hierarchical governance as a machine for learning from implementation experiences, if you like. But there are a number of open questions. One is under what conditions do actors really use these non-hierarchical governance approaches? Another one is whether these non-hierarchical governance processes are temporary. Are they doomed to wither away after some temporary experience with them, or can they show resilience and be durable over time? And finally, how can gridlock be avoided? After all, it is more the rule than the exception that there are redistributive conflicts among parties, and this can create impasse and gridlock. So there is a big question here of how this non-hierarchical governance can try to overcome these problems. Now, just to give you a taster of some of the empirical analysis that I carried out, I'm gonna make a comparison. I'm gonna use a few minutes to make a comparison between electricity and gas in the issue area of network access regulation. So as we probably all know in this venue, network access regulation was identified from the very beginning of market liberalization and integration as really fundamental. Of course, electricity transmission lines as well as gas pipelines, they are considered natural monopolies. So it's really vital that you ensure non-discriminatory access to them. Otherwise, you cannot have competition. In both cases, we had non-hierarchical arrangements. I mentioned them at the very beginning of the talk. For electricity, we have the so-called Florence Forum. For gas, we have the so-called Madrid Forum. They are exactly the same, except that they meet in two different countries and they focus on two different sectors. But what they have in common is that they bring together a variety of actors, both public authorities and actors from the private sector, at multiple levels of governance. So we have EU public authorities such as the European Commission, but we also have national authorities such as member states and national regulators. We also have a variety of companies, and we also have consumer associations. How were these common institutional arrangements used in practice? Well, we can see quite some variation here. So in electricity, the European Commission made an extensive use of the Florence Forum from the late 1990s to the current date, and that really helped compare and discuss a variety of approaches that were being experimented at the national level and then at the macro-regional level to tackle network access regulation. And this led a number of times to non-binding agreements within the forum, which were then regularly codified into binding legislation. So in the first case, in electricity, there was a lot of experimentalist governance, also in practice, and this was resilient. It stretched across different policy cycles. In gas, the pattern was very different. There was an initial engagement with experimentalism, but by the mid-2000s, the European Commission made the rulemaking process much less inclusive, and it imposed from the top a certain solution, firm use it or lose it, with which then compliance was monitored ever since. So in gas, in contrast to electricity, there was a much more hierarchical process. How can we explain this variation in governance processes? Well, if we look at the formal powers, we don't really go very far because formal powers were exactly the same across the two sectors. So I argue that we need to put more attention on uncertainty as well as opposition. In electricity, no actor knew from the beginning how best to achieve the identified broad goal. And so that indeed induced these more inclusive processes of looking at various experiments. And also coalitions had to be formed around solutions that at given points in time seem to be the most promising ones. In gas, instead, by the mid-2000s, the publicly available evidence says that the European Commission had a very clear idea. It was convinced to know the best solution already. That was very simple. It was just a stricter version of the previously existing solution. And the Commission was not alone in this belief. It was also supported by very influential regulators, namely the Austrian and German ones. Okay, so here I really put, from an explanatory angle, I invite to put emphasis on the cognitive as well as the political factors. Now, and this potential contrast I'm introducing in this slide, also from the energy sector, is not in the book. It's in part in some research I publish in separate articles, and in part is work I've been doing these days. So I particularly value feedback as well. Here we might see a similar contrast. So on the one side, we have the so-called REMIT, which is the regulation of energy market integrity and transparency. And on the other side, we can look at the support schemes to promote renewables. When we look at the REMIT, the picture that emerges seems to be quite experimentalist. In the sense that quite similarly to the pharmacovigilance approach in pharmaceutical regulation that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, here we have the ACER, the EU regulatory agency, collecting a lot of information. Last year alone, ACER collected more than 8 billion transactions data that were reported to it by lower level actors, including national regulatory authorities. Then there is a quite inclusive analysis of this data to see whether there has been or not an abuse. And this has led over time to a number of revisions. So if you look at the non-binding guidances and the Q&A documents issued by ACER, well, you see that ACER has updated the definition of market manipulation and insider trading a number of times. More recently, there has been a revision of the whole piece of legislation. So we had the so-called REMIT 2, and this was done, among other things, to make sure that this piece of regulation is updated to take into account new developments that could not be anticipated when it was first introduced, notably algorithmic trading. So we see that there is quite a lot of monitoring of implementation experiences, and this leads to revisions of the regulation itself. When we look at the support schemes to promote renewables, I argue that there has not been much learning in the sense that experimentalism would suggest. I'm not denying that there has been some learning of some type, but if there had been experimentalist learning, what we would have observed is the European Commission orchestrating benchmarking exercises to see which support schemes are performing best. And then based on these performance reviews, the Commission would have proposed the harmonization of support schemes on that basis. But the data tells us that this is not what happened. Publicly available evidence tells us that in the late 2000s, the Commission refrained from proposing to harmonize support schemes based on feed-in tariffs, even if back then feed-in tariffs were the support scheme that was outperforming all the other ones. And back then, the problems with feed-in tariffs had not emerged yet. Okay, so how can we explain this variation? Well, I argue that, and actually we can see that the approach on support schemes has been quite hierarchical in the sense that the Commission, at some point by the mid-2000s, got tired of being seeing its attempt to harmonize support schemes based on market solutions, being frustrated at the legislative level, and at some point it made use of its state aid powers where it is unconstrained. So it really imposed from the top the solutions that it had preferred from the very beginning. So we see that there is quite some variation in the governance processes used across these two cases, and also in the uncertainty that was perceived by key actors. In REMIT, it is written, it is candidly acknowledged that this was an unprecedented endeavor, and therefore, we needed really to learn from experience and adapt on that basis. On the support schemes, we don't see that. We see actually the Commission, rightly or wrongly, safeguarding the single market and the market-based approaches. Now, in the next few slides, I just want to give you a bird's eye view on other sectors that I looked at in the book. I'm going to be very, very brief. So here you can see that the book looked at 5 sectors, and for each of them, I broke down each sector in 2 issue areas. So I had 10 cases in total. And what the takeaway from this table is very simple. What I want to argue, what I want to show is that even though in all these cases there were experimentalist arrangements available, not always did they lead to corresponding governance processes. In some cases, yes, other times, not. If we look at sequences and trajectories, we can see that although there was a relative majority of cases where experimentalist, non-hierarchical governance proved resilient over time, this was not always the case. And I have mentioned in this presentation that in the case of gas, in the issue of network access, there was an initial engagement with experimentalism, but then this was followed by a return to conventional hierarchical governance. And finally, if we look at the mechanisms or the devices that were used to overcome gridlock, we can see that most of the time, public authorities used both positive threats and negative threats, what in the political science and law literature would be called shadow hierarchy and penalty defaults, respectively. So here the idea is that the Commission, for example, told parties, okay, either you come up with an agreement among yourselves by this deadline, or I am going to impose a positive solution myself. Or in other cases, the Commission threatened, but the threat was negative. So the Commission said, either you come up with an agreement yourself, or I'm going to fine you. I'm going to impose a sanction. I'm going to impose a prohibition. All right, so what can we learn from all this? Well, the first conclusion is that there is a value in creating and designing non-hierarchical institutional structures, because this can help both learning, but also coalition building. So there is both a cognitive advantage and also a political one. And I didn't have time to discuss this in the presentation, but there are cases in which this was useful, even though actors had very strongly centralized formal powers. So if we look, for example, at the first antitrust case against Google, the European Commission clearly had very strong powers that it could exercise against Google, but it didn't know what to impose. Okay, so that can push for non-hierarchical governance, even in presence of strong powers. Another reason can also be political opposition. Which, if you are afraid that a certain measure will create a political backlash, then you might go for more inclusive processes, even if formally speaking you would have the powers to go for more hierarchical ones. However, of course, we should be wary that institutions don't determine behavior. And indeed, in contexts where actors are cognitively confident and also can rely on readily available political support that they might ignore, or even worse, they might convert non-hierarchical arrangements to hierarchical purposes. When these non-hierarchical processes are actually used, they often are durable, and that is because, or at least in part, because uncertainty and opposition might resurface. So you might find a solution to a given problem, you might create a coalition around it, but the implementation of that solution might create new problems in a few years' time. And at that point, you need to restart, you need to find new solutions and create new consensus around them. And finally, to overcome impasse, actors do not need to use any single device. The evidence actually says that positive and negative threats are not mutually exclusive, and indeed, they are often used together. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to our discussion and your comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bernardo, for your presentation. Very interesting, because actually you show how there are many ways to produce rules. You call them governance model, but are different ways to produce rules, and they have different properties. They are more or less suitable depending on various conditions, including what we know, what we don't know about how to best regulate sector. And I think that the long challenge and still enduring challenge of creating an internal market for energy in Europe is a good example for that. But I'm not an expert. We invited two people to challenge you, so I will give you, I will give the floor or the screen to Turbjörg. First, pose a couple of questions to you, and then you can reply. Please, Turbjörg.
Thank you, Nicolo, and thank you so much, Bernardo, for this presentation and for an excellently written book. I've been enjoying reading it.
We cannot hear you.
Try again, Turbjörg.
Okay, well, how about now?
Now, yes.
Okay, let's try. So I enjoyed reading the book recently, and before I move to my questions, I want to compliment you on both showing what is happening across different sectors, the high specialization of regulatory governance in Europe. Most of us tend to stick to one sector, so it's really useful to have this cross-sectoral perspective. This governance functions in practice, and I think that also really adds to our knowledge of this, of how we regulate our economy and society in Europe. I think it's very useful. So I want to ask you to contextualize your work in respect to two other or to two important changes that we've observed in EU governance, in regulatory governance over the last 2 decades. Times, at least if we look at before and after 2000. And some of these have gotten more decision-making powers over time. So this includes ACER, for instance. The other development is that it's kind of also, again, this is in a 2-decade comparison, is the emphasis and the formalization of various forms of stakeholder involvement, stakeholder participation. So this can be various requirements.
If you move too much, sometimes we lose sound. Can you repeat again your last 2 sentences? Because we lost you for a couple of seconds again. No, try again.
How about now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Because I assume that
conversation with IT afterwards. Anyways, so the first one was the growth of EU agencies, some getting more decision-making powers over time. The second development is the emphasis of stakeholder participation. So this can be a formal requirement to consult private actors, have expert groups, advisory boards, in some cases even have private actors draft or co-draft proposals. So this can be something that happens more informally. It can also be regulated in EU law that this and this specific actor or actor type is to be formally part of the rulemaking process. So we have this in electricity and gas, for instance. So I would just wonder to hear your perspective on how these two developments, so more EU agencies, more stakeholder participation, how do they relate to experimentalist governance processes?
Thank you. So Bernardo, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I would say on the first point, on more decision-making powers for EU agencies, my immediate reply would be, this is certainly true, but in most cases, there is still the EU within energy and beyond is a very polyarchic or very multipolar. So the normal distribution of powers is polyarchic or multipolar, which means, as opposed to centralized, which means that it's quite rare that a single actor can impose its own view unilaterally. Okay. Now, in some situations, you have this, or at least you have this more than commonly so. So, for example, in competition law, the European Commission has very strong powers. Equally, if you look at the regulation of credit rating agencies, ESMA has direct powers there. But that's not the rule. So I think from an experimentalist point of view, what's interesting is that even in these extreme cases, you oftentimes see that the actor having these centralized powers doesn't use them hierarchically. And then, of course, the question is why? How is it possible? Because formally, they could, okay? And I argue, well, that can be in part because of uncertainty. As I said, the antitrust case, the first antitrust case against Google, it's incredible because, the European Commission initially used some commitment procedures. In the end, it didn't work. The Commission went for a strong prohibition decision, imposing a then record fine of 2 billion euros. But the prohibition decision of the Commission was 700 paragraphs long, and there are only 2 paragraphs dedicated to how to resolve the remedy. And in those 2 paragraphs, the Commission says it is up to Google, not the Commission, to come up with a solution. Okay, so I think that is quite telling. But anyway, your question was on the energy sector, but I would say that this can also apply in other situations. So I would say yes, there has been certainly more formalization, more powers, but EU agencies are still quite constrained, and this also links in a way to your second point. These obligations for consultation, etc. This is precisely what I'm talking about. That you cannot come up with a solution unilaterally yourself most of the time. Now, I think that one could create a third question from your second one, and that is, you mentioned that this inclusive procedures, sometimes they are formal obligations, other times they are informal, but they happen. Okay, and that I think pushes us as researchers to wonder what's the relationship between informal practices and formal institutions. Sometimes we might see processes emerging informally, and then they work pretty well, and then legislators say, you know what, we are gonna create this we're gonna make this the rule everywhere. That can be one way of seeing it. But again, why are there these inclusive procedures? I think in part for political reasons, and in part also for cognitive reasons. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Bernardo. Torbjörg, are you satisfied?
Yes, very. Thank you for these interesting reflections. You already mentioned some lessons that policymakers could pick up from observing the processes, what works. And your book offers a lot of insights on how these governance operate in practice. So do you have any clear-cut policy recommendations or kind of implications for policymakers that you would want to highlight, for instance, in terms of ensuring effective and legitimate regulatory governance?
Yeah, I think this also follows up very nicely with what we just mentioned. So I think that the insights here would be for institutional design, so showing the value of having this kind of institutional structures that can help debate, exchange of experiences, etc., etc. And as I said, they can be helpful both for cognitive reasons and for political reasons. However, at the same time, we should be cautious because, as an Italian, person, I know very well that institutions oftentimes can be manipulated. They oftentimes do not work as they are supposed to. So, yes, great to have things like the Florence Forum, etc., but there is always the risk that then the Commission goes there with a solution that it has already in mind, and this is an empty shell. And that's why we need to look both at institutional arrangements, but also at how they work in practice. As a political scientist, you're very familiar with this dynamics.
Thank you, Bernardo. Let's move now to Max, who prepared a couple of questions. Please, Max.
Yeah, and thanks very much, Nicolo, and thank you, Bernardo. Like Torbjörg, I'll start by congratulating you on this book. Really excellent, really, and also really really interesting to read. I mean, the detail of the process tracing is really impressive, and it flows quite well. The sort of the storytelling of the different sectors. I think also really important already that conclusion that you've highlighted in several instances that, just because something looks experimentalist on paper doesn't really mean that that the actors will actually follow through and be experimentalist. As somebody with a legal background, I thought also important that you say, and I hope I understand you right, just because there's a legal provision, just because something has the appearance of hard law, of law, doesn't necessarily mean that it excludes experimentalism, or that conversely, just because there isn't a firm rule, that automatically leads to experimentalism. So that already, I think, is also a really important sort of condition to put in place generally. I wanted to ask you, first of all, a little bit about that very distinction between not a hierarchical and non-hierarchical or experimentalist governance, by linking it to that law debate between hard and soft law. Now, you explicitly set those things apart, that non-hierarchical governance doesn't mean soft law, but I think there's maybe that's a similar issue that we encounter when we distinguish hard and soft law, that hard is sort of the archetype, the ideal type, and then any departure from that is soft. This, I should say, is not an original point. I'm drawing on arguments by Kenneth Armstrong in this. I'm wondering, is that something that you also encounter when you distinguish experimentalist and hierarchical governance? And if so, how did you confront that when drawing the line between the two modes of governance, that you have essentially the ideal type and then just gradations of the other, essentially? My second question was related more to these mechanisms and conditions that you highlight for the activation of experimentalist governance. Really interesting, and you came to this also at the end of your presentation, where you say, uncertainty, presence of legal rules to a degree, polyarchy are conditions under which experimentalism might or might not flourish, and then it's that positive shadow hierarchy or the negative penalty defaults that might actually push actors into making use of it, into producing outcomes from it. I was wondering if you could spend a little bit time talking about the relationship between within those conditions, and also between the conditions and mechanisms. So I'm thinking, for example, could you say that diffusion of legal power creates uncertainty? So does one condition reinforce another condition? Or between those two mechanisms, could you, for example, intuitively, I might think that, say, political opposition would constrain an actor into using the shadow of hierarchy, that positive threat of rulemaking. Is there a relationship between that? Just be interested in your thoughts on that point. And thank you so much again.
Thank you, Max, for giving back the word to Bernardo. I remind the audience that you can start writing down any questions or comment in the Q&A box. Because after the answer by Bernardo, we will come to you. Please, Bernardo, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I mean, these points are also really good. So starting from the first one about hard law, soft law, and experimentalist governance, hierarchical governance. Yes, indeed. In a debate which is older about new modes of governance versus old modes of governance, basically one indicator was indeed, we are in front of new modes of governance if this is soft law, but when it comes to legislation, binding legislation, then it's old. And the experimentalist scholars, they want to reject this, and they say it explicitly, and then I refer to their point, and they say, actually, this is not a defining, a distinctive indicator, okay? And even though one of the points by Thorberg was about procedures, somehow it comes back to the thing of informal versus formal. I mean, you find often that agreements are brokered in, say, a forum, and then legislation codifies that, but it really copy-pastes them, okay? So I don't think we should then characterize this as a hierarchical governance, okay? So I think the first point is this. I think, we really, and somehow, of course, it also links to your second question or point, which is then what kind of indicator should we use, to distinguish hierarchical from non-hierarchical governance? And the issue of ideal types, yes, you find that a number of times I had to indeed figure out myself how to address that issue. I think my solution, and it's not mine, of course, is to treat this indeed as ideal types, in the Weberian sense. So these are ideal types that empirical developments may only partially approximate. Okay, so you almost never have a pure manifestation of that. And that's fine, that's totally okay, as long as you are clear on the indicators that you use to distinguish more or less hierarchical or non-hierarchical governance in this case. And that's why it becomes very useful to then say, I'm not talking about either or, a rigid dichotomy, I'm talking about more or less. Now, the indicators, of course, they have to speak to the theory, but they also have to make sense with the data you have. So you have to, play a bit around them, going back and forth between, the cases you have and the theories you want to contribute to. And then the last point on the relationship between conditions and also mechanisms. I mean, that's a difficult one, and I don't have I would reply that this would be, a great area for you to investigate, because certainly there is space for progressing on that. The existing literature, when it talks about uncertainty, it doesn't really say very much about the origins, except it stays at a very general level. So it says, a variety of factors, including globalization, the disintegration of value chains, and rapidly changing sectors, they all might contribute to uncertainty. I argue that the perceived uncertainty is much more important than objective uncertainty, because in some sectors you have actors that are more or less reluctant to openly acknowledge uncertainty. If you look at pharmaceuticals, the EMA, they are candid about, they say clinical trials cannot fully eliminate uncertainty. We do them very well, etc. But at the end of the day, you will discover new things when the medicine is used by a wider population. And that's why we need monitoring afterwards and revisions, etc. If you speak to legal scholars, especially in DG Comp, legal practitioner in DG Comp, I had an interview with somebody who told me, in this case, regulating booking.com, we didn't know what to do. I don't personally think we should be ashamed of that, but that was, it was an exceptional view. Many people, they said, no, the Commission cannot openly recognize that we do not know how to do a certain thing. And of course, then because of course, from the legal perspective, you can also understand, what about legal certainty then, So this opens huge questions. Thanks.
Really interesting. Thank you. Very, inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Marzia, do we have anything in the box? Our participants are asking questions.
No, they've been shy, I think. It's been extremely interesting, but maybe a bit too far from energy. So maybe you want to ask something about I think you mentioned the comparison between the REST and the REMIT, that you had a comment. So maybe that would be a good time.
Thank you, Marzia. Yes, indeed. While you were discussing, Bernardo, Torbjörg, Max, you focused a lot on uncertainty. And then I was trying to think about the case of REMIT and renewable support schemes that Bernardo is also looking at, and the differentiation between the two. Then my comment could be, Bernardo, that in the case of renewable support scheme, the issue is not really uncertainty, but really the inevitable political discussion that they raise, because basically there are ways to give money to people. Of course, maybe there are some details that we don't know exactly, or we didn't know exactly which one was better, working better, but we for sure know that it's about giving money. So there is inevitably a political component. And this maybe was the reason why the first attempt to make some experiments, apply experimental governance to them, failed. And this then led to the European Commission to adopt already, I think, in 2014, clear state aid guidelines forbidding certain types or restricting the way in which renewable could be supported. And this limitation then became part of the Renewable Directive, I think, in 2018. I don't know if you already explored this area, please.
So I think you're absolutely right, but it's not the full picture. So I think you're absolutely right. I recently saw Jean-Michel Glachan accidentally in Florence, and he told me this is really difficult. This meaning the green transition is really difficult, and because we are talking about a complete restructuring of behavior, industrial processes. It's a huge change, and therefore redistributive implications, and therefore political fights and all that. That's certainly true. Now, if you look, I traced the preferences of the European Commission as evidenced by Commission proposals, papers, etc. And you see that the European Commission, from the beginning of the regulation of support schemes on renewables, it was pushing for market-based approaches. Initially, green tradable green certificates, etc. And then at some point it changes mind to some extent, in the sense that in the end, it went for auctions, but still a market-based approach. Now, the experimentalist scholars would say that this insistence on certain a category of approaches it means that the Commission was not in a state of strategic uncertainty. Because the scholars say, strategic uncertainty means that at some point you are ready to abandon your strategic predisposition. I'm a market-based person, but I see that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. After 20 years, I become ready to change my mind, okay, in the light of evidence. Of course, this takes decades, all right? And the Commission didn't change its mind, So it remained anchored to market-based approaches. As I said, rightly or wrongly, I mean, there are very good reasons for that, But there were a few years in the late 2000s where feed-in tariffs were outperforming all the other approaches, and the Commission was, it really didn't propose, okay, let's harmonize this and use this as the EU approach. Whereas it certainly did for the market-based approaches.
I see. Okay, so you suggested basically no uncertainty not perceived uncertainty from the point of view of the European Commission, and actually it reiterated this view over time, and finally it imposed the MESA rule for the vast majority of support mechanisms.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at if you trace, the legislative, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, the Commission proposed market-based approaches in the first package of legislation, and it didn't go through. I mean, the harmonization of support schemes based on market-based approaches. Then it tried the second time, even if the tariffs were performing better back then, and it didn't go through. At some point, he got fed. I mean, my interpretation is that he got fed up and he said, you know what, I'm going to use state aid, where indeed this is one of the exceptional cases where there is not a multipolar distribution of powers, and the Commission issued guidelines unilaterally. Then, not accidentally, a few years later, then this was also accepted in the legislation.
Thank you. Fulbjörg, Max, since our participants are a bit shy, I wonder whether you have another question for Bernardo before we up.
Yeah, I actually want to pick up on this discussion that we just had, because I think it's very interesting, because it also ties in with perhaps my first question. And I think your approach it makes sense to categorize, because you look at the distribution of power in an area as a whole. But I think that the difficulties is when you look into a specific process, the specific distribution of power might not be as stable over time as the overall distribution. So I think state aid is a good example of this, because for the Commission to use its powers, its state aid powers for support schemes, it actually was dependent on court case law that actually allowed it to use its competition powers in this area. So it shows that not immense changes in the distribution of power, but these kind of more incremental developments. And I think this also ties in with my question about agency decision makers. So because when we are looking at a specific process or specific issue within a broader sector, say energy, which we are discussing now, I think there might be not a full stability because you have these incremental changes. So I think, yeah, very curious to hear your reflections on that.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I omitted the court role because I thought it was already too complex, the picture I was painting. But you're absolutely right. Now, I'm not sure that so even the Commission, even in competition law, is not fully unconstrained. Indeed, it operates in a situation where there is more or less case law, and there are some constraints of that kind. Would I categorize these constraints as formal decision-making procedures? Probably not. So, I mean, you could also reconceptualize them as indeed the degree of political opposition from the court vis-à-vis the commission. In the sense that because formally speaking, the commission can also issue something, take a decision and all that. But if it knows that then this will backfire because the court will then say, you know what, commission, you're wrong, then it might anticipate this and say, okay, these are the constellations of actors and so on that I'm facing. Let me think twice my steps.
Well, the division of powers strike back. The judiciary against the executive power at the EU level. Max, do you have really a last question for Bernardo?
Yeah, if there's time, I'd love to, and I'll be quick because I realize that we're out of time almost. One thing I was wondering about, just because you started your presentation referring to the COVID pandemic and emergency situations, whether your study allows for any conclusions in relation to the energy crisis and the energy crisis measures that have come out of the REPowerEU package implemented by the Commission to reduce dependency on Russian gas. So you had a lot of EU-level legislation driven by this executive fiat by Council and Commission jointly, with excluding the Parliament. But as you demonstrated in your book, the existence of a rule doesn't necessarily mean it's hierarchical. So any reflections on how emergency and experimentalism fare in crisis in the energy sphere, which I'd be curious about.
So I can use this question to advertise shamelessly a chapter I just co-authored with Mark Thatcher, and there what we argued, and then of course it's up to you to see if how convincing you find the argument or not. But if we look at state aid, there have been a number of temporary frameworks. First, to adapt to the global financial crisis. Okay. Once I spoke with the lawyer working in DigiComp. I said suspension, and he told me no, this is not suspension. Wrong word. State aid is not suspended, but there are these temporary frameworks. Okay, so the Commission is very keen in saying this is temporary, but there has been one for the global financial crisis. Then there has been another one for the Russian for the pandemic. Then there has been another one for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now there has been another one to promote the green transition. So this, what we argue is that this temporary, in the name only, adaptation of state aid control are actually a way for the Commission to adapt to changing contexts. We can discuss whether these are exogenous or endogenous crises, whether they could be anticipated or not. But indeed, you see quite a lot of adaptation ongoing in order to save really important objectives, namely small and medium enterprises, and also the longer objective of the green transition.
Thank you, Bernardo. So maybe the European Commission is becoming a bit more Italian, where we say that there is nothing more permanent than what is temporary. But
becoming more experimentalist.
Exactly, but this would be another story. So I would like really to thank all the participants for the presentation, Bernardo, Torbjörg, Max, and Marzia. I just want to close anticipating you the next FSR Insights. We talked today a bit in the last few minutes about support schemes for renewables. If you want to know more, and 1 month from now, Lena Kitzing from the Danish Technical University and also a part-time professor at FSR will be our guest, and she will present a recent research report on contracts for difference to support renewables. So that's definitely in line, and maybe we will pose some questions that we pose to Bernardo to her as well. Having said that, I want to close thanking also Clara for work in the background, and I wish you a good afternoon and see you in 1 month's time.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye to you, Bernardo.
You. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.